The Hold. A Ouija board prophesied my harm. This story took place at the close of last semester. I go to a boarding school, and so I spend a lot of time with my dorm mates. So every time it is time to go home, I can't help feeling a bit sad. The others do too, which is why they decided to do something last summer. We decided we would have a closing off the semester with a small get-together. I brought meat and drinks. Adam brought snacks, and Dale was to bring games. Instead, he brought a Ouija board. Of course, it was hilarious to see. We plopped the board on the coffee table and turned off the lights. Then we lit the only 2 candles we could find. We asked the basic questions at first. Who it was, where it was from, and it didn't move. No matter what we said, we didn't move it. In raw desperation, Dale asked if any of us would be getting hurt anytime soon, and that's when it started moving. It said yes. This made us laugh ecstatically. We were happy we finally got it to move, and didn't consider what it was actually saying. But that would change with the next question we asked, which was, what would happen? And it replied with a single word. The Ouija board moved and it spelled out the word, die. Only one laugh was barked out now, and it was not a fun laugh. It was a nervous laugh aimed at relieving the tension, but it was pointless. We were all too worried for that, and Dale suggested we stop playing now. But I don't know why we didn't listen. We went one more round, and we asked who would it be. The thing went about and wrote a single word again. It wrote Rob. Rob is my name. We threw the board away and talked about how crazy the whole thing is, but I noticed they kept staring at me when I wasn't looking, and ever since then, I've been holed up at my home. The Cleverer. A Ouija board summoned a spirit at my family's Christmas party. It was the night after Christmas, and my family had fallen asleep, leaving only me and my aunt up at night. My aunt was somewhat drunk, but my aunt's drunkenness isn't the same as most people. While most people go to sleep when drunk, my aunt stays awake until she gets sober again. Then she falls asleep. I didn't mind though, because she was often fun when she was awake. And so there we were in the lounge room, my uncle and my father sleeping on the couch, while the rest of my family slept on the floor and in the rooms upstairs. My aunt suggested we play a game, and she went to the kitchen to get the cards. Moments later, she returned with a Ouija board, and I decided not to press the issue. No point debating a drunk person. After turning off the lights and lighting the phone's flashlight, she placed the board down and hummed as she started asking the questions. We asked the board who it was, and it responded almost immediately. In fact, it was so fast that I started to wonder if my aunt was as drunk as she looked, or if she was pretending to be drunk to trick me into being scared. And the answer was terrifying. The answer it gave was, "Let me out," with 4 exclamation marks. My aunt laughed, and I realized that she must have been really drunk. She said I was clever, and then told the board that it can come out. Almost immediately, glass shattered in the kitchen. Everybody in the room sat up. My aunt laughed very hard at their groggy faces, and I would have joined too, but I was the only one in the room who realized that the thing moved on its own, and there was a suspicious noise from the kitchen. My uncle was annoyed by my aunt and asked they go to sleep, and as people started going up the stairs, we all heard it. 3 hard knocks, My father said he got it and walked off, but the knocking came over and over again. We'd been talking about something else, but the knocking got so insistent, my aunt asked what my dad was doing. And then my dad walked in, and his face was ashen. He said that there was nobody at the door. Only then did people start taking it as seriously as I was. My uncle, my father, and my big brother helped look for the source of the tapping sound. And my aunt's smile was long gone. Instead, she had her arms folded, and looking in her eyes, I could see it. She was completely sober now. I was still looking at the lowest cabinet for the noise, when it suddenly stopped. Turns out, my little sister accidentally knocked over the board, and the sound immediately stopped. I've always found it strange how nobody at home ever talks about that night these days. The nurser. A Ouija board cursed this girl and her mother. I worked as a non-registered nurse at the school in our neighborhood. Non-registered means I was just some person whom they could find who could give band-aids to the kids, but not any kind of medical expert. It was safe though, because nobody actually got hurt. Not physically at least. Most had psychological issues, and the worst case had been a European teen girl, whom I will call Casey. Casey was always getting in trouble in school, and she was barely keeping up with the grades. One day, she just appeared in my office. She and I started to talk for a bit about her schoolwork and the likes, but then we finally moved on to the main topic. She told me that the reason why she couldn't concentrate in school was because she was suffering from depression. Depression, she claimed, was caused by a curse. She told me that they were cursed, her and her mother, and it depressed her. This is one of the strangest missing homework excuses I'd ever heard. So I asked her who cursed them, and she told me that it was an object back at her home. And so I asked her to bring it to school the following day so we can destroy it or something. The following day, Casey arrived in my office in the morning before going to any class. She brought the cursed object with her. She also brought a surprise. Her mother. Casey's mother wasn't very good in English, but she was here for some reason. She too seemed to believe she'd been cursed. She told me how her first husband passed on, and so did any other man that she took as a lover. And now her daughter was at risk too. And so I asked for this cursed board, and it was a Ouija board. I kept the board and told them they could leave. After that, I guess Casey's grades started improving, but I am not too comfortable living with that thing in my office. The Philosopher. A Ouija board revealed my shocking ancestry. Mandy and I were playing with the Ouija board that had been laying around at my home for a while now, but no one was ever interested in using it. It was a sunny Wednesday afternoon, so there was no need for candles. Instead, we just put up the board, and Mandy immediately blurted out, "Can you poop in the afterlife?" Yes, she was indeed asking the questions of a philosopher, but I didn't see how that would be any fun. So we started asking deeper questions, like when did the spirit die, and what was its name? It kept moving around the board, giving funny and weird answers, and Mandy would make fart noises with her tongue, so it's not hard to see what was happening there. Finally though, Mandy asked the question that dampers this fun memory. It is a rather innocent enough question, but it's a question that went on to turn my world upside down. Mandy asked the board what was my parents' names. The board then gave a name that I didn't recognize. Again, I thought it was Mandy, and I laughed. And I guess she thought I was the one who had moved it too, because I remember she laughed too. Anyway, much later, my parents were home, We were talking about our day, and I told my mother who the board said my parents were. When my mother heard the names, she looked at me in surprise, and she hurried out the door, crying, and I had no idea what I'd done wrong. It was so awkward living at home for the next couple of days. But then finally, I came home from school one day, and my mom and dad were sitting at the table. They sat me down and prepared me for a talk. They told me that my grandmother wasn't actually my grandmother. Turns out that my mother had been adopted, and so my mother finally got to the point. She asked me where I had heard those names. To be more specific, she wanted to know if anybody had called me asking for her. Except nobody had called me. It was the Ouija board that gave me those names. When I told her that, I couldn't believe the fury that crossed her face. I understand that she was glad that her real mother called her and stuff, but the problem is, she didn't. It was the Ouija board that told me the name. You know, I actually think that maybe her parents are dead. The mover. The Ouija board predicted a shocking secret. Okay, so you will need a bit of a background for this one. So I'd moved to this apartment a while ago, and it was the second apartment I'd moved to in my life. I lived in it with a guy, and we split the rent. But the apartment had a lot of problems, to say the least. It wasn't in a building, rather it was alone, a distance away from the other buildings, and we were somewhat surrounded by forest. There were birds that tended to fly over us, and they would land wherever they wanted in our apartment. Don't get me started, and don't get me started on the cockroaches. Anyway, we had finally had enough of it, and we were looking for people online who would help us get rid of these things. While we were doing that, my friend told me that he would like for us to play a game of Ouija. I decided to relent, and we set up the board. Immediately, the first thing I asked was, how do we get rid of all these things? The board responded, leave the stone unturned. We played more later, but that's what you need to know for now. It told us to leave the stone unturned. We moved out of the apartment at some point, and I went to get a job. But I recently got a newspaper, and our apartment was on the front page. Apparently, there was a body found in the apartment, a body of a little girl. It had been buried under what looked like ground, but it turned out it was actually a massive boulder. So, a rock. The greener. My little cousin spoke to a spirit with a Ouija board. This reminds me of the time my little cousins were still young. Every time they visited my home, they liked running around the house, and more often than not, they would come into my house and disturb me while I am trying to exist. It was quite a headache, and so I came up with an idea one day to try and scare them. I told them to get the Ouija board. I explained to them how it works, and when they understood that we were communicating to spirits, I immediately got to work. I asked the spirit what was its name, and I wrote demon. I asked what it wanted, and I made it say to eat children, and I made it say lots of other things, but it seemed my plan was backfiring. The kids were only getting excited. In fact, they started to play the game themselves. I was communicating to another spirit when suddenly one of them made the piece move by themselves. The oldest of them all, Hector, looked at me with a massive grin, and my irritation was almost choking. The new spirit introduced itself as Randy. Randy died when he was going to school one morning, and now he spends his days just visiting people as they sleep to take care of them. A stupid story if you ask me at the time, but things, well, they would take a sudden turn. My aunt arrived and took the kids away, and while I was left alone, I looked at the thing and said goodbye, Randy. The board moved. It said goodbye.